So good morning. I'm Greg Chen. I'm the Director of Advocacy with the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And my role here really is just to welcome everybody here and to say that we're really pleased that AILA can offer this space for which would be an excellent briefing on this important topic of the in-country processing for children from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I'm going to say some very brief comments really to provide context for why AILA thinks this issue is so important and what our level of engagement it is. But our expertise is really not at all in the in-country refugee processing part of this issue. Our focus has really been on what happens domestically here in the United States, particularly with regard to what has happened with the U.S. treatment of not just children who are coming unaccompanied, but also families, particularly mothers and children, and how they're being detained and processed upon arrival and apprehension here in the United States. So our focus has really been here stateside. And AILA has been, and I'll be very direct about this, quite critical about how this administration, I won't even mention Congress, but how this administration has approached this problem ever since June of last year. You may recall that initially the President and DHS spoke of this as a humanitarian issue, one that required a humanitarian response. And I think there's probably no disagreement in this room that that continues to be the way that this issue needs to be approached. However, very shortly after early June, within about 2 or 3 weeks, the President began describing this publicly as a border security problem. And that shift in tone and message quickly turned into a deterrence and enforcement approach rather than one that is marked by humanitarian and protection approaches. AILA subsequently was working hand in hand with many of you as advocates and other people that were in the areas affected, particularly in the border regions. I know this is more focused on what's happening outside of the country, but we were focused domestically at looking at how the government was beginning to apprehend and detain children and also families. And many of our attorneys volunteered on their own to represent families that were held in detention. And in that setting, we represented about several hundred people, and we met with over 1,200 different families and children. And what we have seen overwhelmingly, and I'll just give one general statistic, is that the children or the families who are detained are qualifying or are demonstrating eligibility preliminarily for asylum at extremely high rates. USCIS now has a statistic up on its website showing very high rates of initial credible fear grant rates done by the asylum officers in the order of about 80+% during the months of July through late January for just family detention population. That is extremely high, way above the overall statistics. And we think that shows how significant the numbers are of people who qualify for asylum. And so we're just very pleased that there is this amount of attention given to this issue by advocates. But the administration continues not to take this approach. And I think that's the challenge we have. We have very less experience on the issue of what's happening over in those countries and the kind of aid that's needed. We certainly recognize the critical nature of having root causes be addressed in those countries. We've been disappointed to see the lack of funding and support that's come from Congress, and also generally the lack of emphasis that the administration has given to these topics. But I'm going to let that topic be something for Naomi and the rest of you to address today. But we're really pleased to have you here. We want to just give the context for why we think this issue is so important, and we're honored that you're here today. One operational context or operational issue I'll mention, the bathrooms are through these doors and to the left, and there's 2 right in the back. And I think Naomi may have other logistics things for the day to mention to you. But welcome and thanks very much.
Thank you, Greg. I do first want to start by thanking AILA for hosting us, for all of the sponsors, and for all of the speakers, and a special thanks to Jen Smyers, because without her, this absolutely would not have come together. So let's give her a round of applause. So I'm Naomi Steinberg. I'm the director of Refugee Council USA. We are a coalition based here in DC, and we focus on refugee protection, welcome, and building excellence in the U.S. resettlement program. Today we're going to hear a lot about the need for us to collaborate, the refugee resettlement community and the broader immigrant rights community. And I think it's important to note that this is not just an aspirational concept. In order for this Central American Minors Program to work, it is essential that we all come together and figure out a really good way to collaborate moving forward. This is not really an option. It's essential if we want to see this program work. And we're going to hear a lot about that today. So I think just be prepared. You're going to hear the word collaborate repeatedly. So just be ready for that. I think it's also important to note that this program is here. It exists. In-country processing has launched. It launched at the end of last year. And so now it's our job to make sure that implementation goes smoothly. But it's also important to recognize from the very beginning, right now, that there are a lot of challenges that still remain with this program, and there's a lot of advocacy for us all still to do. As the day goes on, you're going to hear about some of the protection issues, either that this program doesn't address, or in some cases might actually be causing. So I just want to be upfront and transparent about the fact that while we think this program has a very important part as a part of the solution to this situation, it is only a small piece of the puzzle, and a lot of work remains to be done to make sure that it works in safety, that children are not endangered because of this program, and that other means for seeking asylum are not reduced because this program exists. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to just walk through the major themes that we're going to cover during the agenda, just to give you a sense of what you can all be looking forward to today. First, we're going to be talking about the background, setting the stage. Why are these children and why are these families coming? What is going on in the home countries that is forcing so many people to make the really difficult decisions to flee to the United States? Because many of these children and families who will be coming through this program will be part of the refugee resettlement process, we're going to do a Refugee Resettlement 101, essentially to help all of us understand what is refugee resettlement, what will these children and families be entitled to upon arrival in the United States. We're also going to talk really, and I know a lot of you have questions about this, what are the details of this program? How does this program work? How can you be eligible? How can children come? What does this entail? And so we're going to really kind of get into the weeds of what that looks like. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about, as I've alluded to, some of the broader protection issues associated with this program, and also really talk about what advocacy remains to be done. Because we will be collaborating on this, we also want to focus a little bit on next steps. How can we continue to work together and really look at this as just sort of an opening dialogue, but one that should be ongoing. And a couple of logistical things. One, we're not going to do a round of introductions now. It's a good problem to have that we have so many people in the room that would take too much time. But so I will ask that when you ask questions, and we've been intentional about building time into the agenda so there's plenty of time for Q&A, to say who you are and the organization you're representing. And also, we are recording this because while there are many people in the room, we know that there are many, many people who couldn't be here, and that across the country, people are interested in this and have questions. So today's proceedings will be shared among all of our community networks. So please be aware that you are being recorded, and if that is a concern, you can let one of us know and we'll do our best to address that. Okay? So any questions before we get started? Good, that's what I like to see. Okay, so we can go ahead and with the first panel then.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary DeLorey, and I'm with the Jesuit Conference. And I am going to just give a brief overview of some of the country conditions. There'll be an opportunity for questions and answers afterwards, and certainly there are people around the table who have various types of expertise that will be able to complement this, but we'll go through some of the basics that we're aware of. So if you're going to go. Thank you. I've borrowed some of the stats from the UNHCR's Children on the Run report just to have as a framework. This is pulling out the stats that are specifically referring to the percent of children who interviewed in that study who were forcibly displaced, who have a need for international protection, both who are fleeing from issues of gang violence or other forms of direct threat, as well as those who have survived or have been the victims of domestic abuse and other types of violence. The report, obviously, the timing of the report was particularly important and particularly useful. There are a multiplicity of reasons, as Leslie later on will go into, but we wanted to pull out particularly those statistics because that is the factor that in the last few years has been unique and distinct in the flows that we're seeing. If you want to go to the next one. So this was published around the time of the steep increase over the summer of the kids arriving because it was aligning what was being seen in the report with also where the kids are coming from. And it was very highly associated, particularly in Honduras and El Salvador, with the areas where you have very high rates of gang violence, very high rates of organized crime, San Pedro Sula, Tegucigalpa in Honduras, San Salvador, and Guatemala City. Where you have the worst problems, particularly with the gang violence. The outlier here is in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. That is not as violent as the urban areas, but there are high rates of Guatemalan children who have been coming from that area. That is the poorest part of Guatemala and has some of the highest rates, not only for the Western Hemisphere, but in the world, of chronic malnutrition, of very high marginalization and poverty, and a high rate of traditional migration that has come out from earlier years of great violence in that region. Go to the next one. So Honduras has the highest per capita murder rate in the world. El Salvador and Guatemala, it's fluctuated somewhat, but they usually are around 4th and 5th globally. We've seen a growing rate of internal displacement. The displacement towards the U.S. is not generally the first level of displacement. The only country of the three that has had a substantive study on this has been El Salvador, and was really looking at how many times people were starting to displace. El Salvador is a very small country with a gang problem throughout the country. There really is not places that are safe for people to displace to, so they're crossing borders. In Guatemala, the dynamic is somewhat different. You don't have the same level of control of entire cities, and you have other areas that people are displacing too, so you have some different dynamics with that. But in general, people are displacing into neighboring countries as well and continuing to be threatened. So we have reports of Salvadorans who were displaced 5 times. In Guatemala, they were threatened by some of the same groups. Others have been displaced into Nicaragua and are again threatened by the same groups. So we're not finding refuge necessarily in neighboring countries. We've seen this 712% increase of asylum petitions in Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, neighboring areas. So it's not only coming towards the U.S. And although this is cut off at the bottom, one of the points I wanted to make is that certainly many of the kids who are coming, they have multiple reasons. They're also coming to reunite with family, and partly because family is where they're going to find safety. But you also have the problem of many children of migrants who are specifically being targeted for extortion and for violence because they're receiving remittances, because they're seen as having additional resources. So they have a unique category that has being targeted for other reasons. Go on. Now this, I wanted to use this, I think this was very helpful. This is kind of a mishmash of a couple of different graphics. The graphic that you see in terms of the homicide rates, you have obviously the rates for Honduras extremely high. This was in 2012. There was a dip in El Salvador's murder rates due to a gang truce that has gone back up. It is not as low as it's mentioned there. They give the rates per 100,000. That's in comparison to the U.S. It's 4.5 to 4.8 murders per 100,000. So you have 800% more higher murder rate in Guatemala and El Salvador, and considerably higher. It's 19 times as high in Honduras as the murder rate in the U.S. The other graphic I wanted to just put up there because it is really looking at the link between inequality and violence. This has the first figures are basically the population rate, 5.7 million in El Salvador. 47.9 is the rate of poverty. In both Honduras and Guatemala, you have not only really high poverty rates, the numbers in white, you also have very high rates of extreme poverty. And the third figure there is the average educational level. So fourth grade, 4.1 in Guatemala, 6.5 in Honduras, etc. So it's looking at, it's not simply a correlation between poverty and violence, it's much more of a correlation between inequality and marginalization and then subsequent violence. This pulls out, I think, the Pew study, the Pew Research Center circulated this, and fortunately it got a good deal of coverage earlier last year, of looking at the change that was happening, and many of your organizations have certainly seen, of the higher percentages of girls that are coming. Certainly it's still adolescent boys and young men, but the rates of girls coming alone has obviously increased substantially. That's particularly in the case of Honduras. The rates of gender-based violence are extreme throughout the three countries. Women and girls are being targeted, certainly for femicide, for rape. There's also the problem of girls and women being targeted as the spouses, as the girlfriends, as the mothers, as the sisters of either gang members or of people that the police or military are targeting, and again are being victimized. So you're seeing this marked increase of those who are arriving, but it's reflective of the reality of just how extreme gender-based violence is. This just breaks down a bit. Obviously, the problems that are in Central America, they've been a long time coming. The one positive thing of this current situation is greater international attention to what has been a very significant problem for a long time and been getting worse. But just to run down, in Guatemala and El Salvador, and certainly in Nicaragua as well, you had from Guatemala starting in the 1960s, but primarily in the 1970s and into the early 1990s, the violence of civil wars. In Honduras, you had a different dynamic. It wasn't an open civil war, but you did have high rates of human rights abuses and a more undeclared level of violence that was happening, or a level of conflict. It resulted in refugee flows at that point in time. Many of those refugees, of course, as your organizations know well, were not recognized officially as refugees. Many eventually got temporary protective status, but that was not, it didn't allow people to have the kind of integration that they would have been able to have as refugees or to reunite with families. So you started to have this massive divided families. There are very high rates of children who are growing up without their parents, without one or both of their parents, and with higher rates of vulnerability and risk factors throughout the three countries. At the same time that this was going on, after the wars came to an end in the early 90s, you had very limited reintegration of many of the armed actors. So both those who had been insurgents or guerrillas and those who had been in the military, they were not well integrated. Their skill set was as armed actors. There's still a lot of guns that were floating around and continue to be prevalent in the region. And as that was going on, many of the kids who had come with their parents in the refugee flows into the U.S. Were not well integrated into the U.S., and particularly in major urban areas such as Los Angeles, quite noticeably. They were becoming involved in gangs. There was a whole crackdown on the gangs over an extended period of time. They were deported en masse into Central America, into this mix that was already problematic. There was very little ways for them to get reintegrated. Certainly they were not seen as your favorite employee, and many of them had very little connection with the countries. It was a very difficult situation for them to go into, and the combination became quite toxic. And you see the rise of MS-13 and the 18th Street gangs throughout the three countries. And at that time, as part of the way the three governments decided to respond to this growing violence was the Mano Duro response, which was rounding up large numbers of young men, particularly, both those who were involved in gangs, but also a broader array of poor young men and incarcerating them. A friend of mine who works with gangs in El Salvador always talks about the graduate school for gangs, which is what he describes many of the detention centers throughout Central America, where they became much more professional and much more connected, and in some cases were forced into gangs, those who were not part of them to start with. And I would just mention in this last one the separate dynamics that are specific to Honduras. Certainly in 2009, with the political coup that occurred at that time, you had a whole another dynamic going on, a politically motivated violence. You've seen since 2009 both an increase of overall violence, of overall human rights abuses, and an increase in poverty and in inequality. So you've got a whole much more complicated and very violent context there. These last two slides, I'm sorry, go back to the last one. This is just illustrating a bit of the additional factor of organized crime and of drug trafficking. Most of the kids and those who have been coming have been targeted more by gang-level violence, not by the organized crime level of violence. However, there is a shift that has been going on in the region as pressure was placed on drug trafficking in Colombia, pressure was placed on the cartels in Mexico. The Mexican cartels have particularly moved into Central America. They don't necessarily focus so much on the kind of kids that we would be seeing. They focus much more on corrupting governments, on using some of the gangs as their lower level type actors, but it has become a much more violent environment because of this dynamic going on with drug traffickers and with organized crime. That's also connected to histories of very weak rule of law in each country and very weak institutions, government institutions, and extremely high levels of impunity that usually are 95 to 98% of crimes end in impunity and are never prosecuted. And you have this problem of historic concentration of power and resources. The famous 14 families that are referenced frequently with Guatemala, and in each country you've had a very concentrated economic power. Just the last one. And of course, it can't be denied the economic factors that are also linked to any flows from the region. You have in each country high levels of unemployment. They refer to the NINIs, the neither employment nor studying. This is significant across the board for particularly young people in urban areas, but it's also even higher rates of young women who are neither studying nor employed and with very few options. In the rural area, there has historically been even greater poverty. And in the case of Guatemala, chronic malnutrition, there's usually a flow first of young people from rural areas into the urban areas. If they can't integrate there or find employment, then they would be crossing borders. And the one thing I would also mention is right now there is a major problem with hunger. There has been a historic drought that has wiped out a good deal of the crops in much of the three countries. It's considered that 2.5 million people will be in need of food aid and pretty extreme conditions for hunger in the 6 months of this year. So it's an additional factor that is complicating the situation. And of course, there has been historically very limited social welfare investment, which includes a very limited investment in child welfare systems. Just the final thing that I would say is there are some hopeful signs in the midst of all this. In terms of El Salvador, particularly, you've had both the last administration and the current government tackling a lot of endemic poverty issues and inequality and trying to make some advances. They haven't got a hold of their security situation yet, but there are some differences happening in that one country that we have not seen before. And with the increased attention to the region, it could be a two-edged sword. There is for those of us who've worked on issues with the region, we're very glad that there's more recognition of how serious the situation is, that there's been some commitment to additional funding. But with additional funding, there's both the opportunity and the risk, particularly considering the nature of some of the public institutions and the reason to be concerned with what they will, how they will use resources and who the U.S. government as well will partner with or not. So with that, I'm out of time, and we'll pass it to Leslie.
Good morning. I am suffering from a bad cold, maybe allergies, but nothing was going to keep me from being able to participate in this event with you all today. So thank you in particular to the leadership of some great NGOs who really brought this together. So what I am here to talk about is actually how the UN Refugee Agency entered this conversation. So folks have been working on Latin American policy for many years because, I mean, quite frankly, the region has been largely ignored, especially as a matter of U.S. policy for many years. We track not so much the development rates or the poverty rates, but we track forced displacement because that's the first big red flag that we're going to have, a flow of persons of concern to the UN Refugee Agency, which would be refugees and other people of concern, which basically is all of the unaccompanied children. So let me take one quick step back to say this region, I mean, the flow of unaccompanied children around the globe is of concern to UNHCR. We see that it has grown in many different regions. And the one here, isolating the region here, there's been this phenomenon of unaccompanied children on the move in pretty large numbers. I mean, we're talking about 8,000, per year being the average. I mean, that's a phenomenon in and of itself, and it's odd, and it's of concern because we're talking about children who are not accompanied with their family members. So in 2008, we wanted to just really get a good feel and interviewed a bunch of children on the southern border of Mexico to find out, okay, of this flow in this phenomenon, are there children with international protection concerns? In other words, are they of concern to the UN Refugee Agency? Or are we talking about family reunification, economic reasons? And in 2008, we interviewed a lot and actually ended up finding that only about 13% of the flow presented factors that could give rise to international protection. So that informed us, right? We've been on a skeletal presence here, which is good in terms of, the Syria crisis and the Central African Republic crisis, and we've got crises all over the world. So for our resources, we've been pretty limited. But then we're watching the numbers double. One of the less glorious things that we do is track the asylum statistics for every government. So who's applying for asylum? How many? What country are they from? How are they approved or not approved? And then we're able to really manipulate that data to see if there's any trends of concern to us. This chart will show you 2000 all the way to 2013. The top green, Honduras, the lighter blue is Guatemala, the darker blue is El Salvador. But you'll see an uptick here in the number of overall asylum claims from individuals from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to countries, to all countries that we track statistics for. So it includes the US, Belize, Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, Sweden. So here are our total numbers. In terms of those who have lodged asylum. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so here's how we see it as trends. You'll see here in this pie chart that the dark blue is actually the highest number of asylum applications are being filed in the United States. This is undeniable. And it's at about 85%. It changes year by year. The other slices of the pie is where, the other significant filing of asylum applications are happening, and that's Mexico, Canada, Costa Rica, and a red sliver that covers others. But then when you drill down a bit, and you'll see here in this chart, This is actually represents where the asylum applications were filed, and we took the U.S. out of the mix. And this was the part that really stuck out for us, is that between 2008 and 2013, we noted a 712% increase in the number of asylum applications by individuals from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, to places other than the United States. So, there's the common narrative of everyone's trying to go to the United States, but then when we see such a dramatic increase in places other than the U.S., I mean, that catches at least the UN refugees' attention. So it's within this context, next slide, please, that we went in and started interviewing. It was time to do another interview. So there was a few NGOs who had already done this. We had Kids in Need of Defense. The Catholic bishops did a mission and really put out a report. We were, Women's Refugee Commission actually was the first one to do focus groups and studies with children who were in detention. And the US government came out and said, UNHCR, can you all come in and help us quantify this? We know the stories of individuals, but we don't know to what extent. So we embarked on a massive research effort. It took us probably longer to negotiate the methodology with the US government so that everyone was on board. If this is how we're going to do that, then we're going to stand by the results, because we were concerned. We said, 3 other NGOs have already put this stuff forward, so what's wrong? And it all came down to, well, methodology, messenger, and we're like, okay, fine. So let's agree with the methodology, and we did that. We went out, we interviewed, had an amazing team of interviewers, 4 people actually who went out and interviewed 404 children. We randomly selected 100 children, aiming for 100 from each one of the 4 countries, so El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, yeah? And we did it randomly. We separated the children so that they couldn't influence each other with, oh, the UN Refugee Agency is here. We made sure to tell them that we have no power in the outcome of your case, so the only reason you'd be talking to us is to maybe inform, and it might help someone 10 years out. I mean, we really limited what our role was, and spent a good 90 minutes, 2 hours with each one of the children. Our questionnaires are on the line, are online. You can see how we did that. Our conversation was on like how we explained what we were doing. So after all of this research and running the numbers, and I will say 4 times, because I was like, this can't be this high. Here, this is the first level that I want to share with you. So children, especially children, always give reasons that are maybe not as organized as immigration lawyers would like them to be. Well, the first reason I'm leaving is because of X, Y, and Z. On the contrary, one child might say, I want to start a rock band, and it's not until the interview is over and he feels comfortable with the interviewers that he's like, oh yes, and by the way, I was a victim of sexual violence in my community. So, having the patience to really wait and give that child enough time to stabilize, to find out this information. I mean, we even learned a lot about the interviewing process, but they gave us a lot of reasons. So a Venn diagram was probably the only way we could really capture it, to show the multi-reasons. So here you're going to see, oh, guys in the back, you have another one. All right, so abuse in the home is this pink-red. Deprivation is how we classified some pretty severe economic deprivation. So not I want a better life, but in order for me to eat, I needed to move type thing. Family opportunity is where we said, I just want to meet with family, or I want to be able to go to a school past 5th grade. We have an other, like the rock band, or the internet is better in, and violence in society, which would encompass both violence from community gangs, even community transnational gangs, which was typical for more urban areas. And in the rural areas, which was really interesting for us to find, we thought, okay, well, the gangs are in the urban areas, not so much in the rural areas. But then they actually were threatened by violence from criminal armed groups, which is how they call them, but more of the narco-trafficking groups, we're moving things through here, a lot of commodities, and, be quiet, help out, do these things. But it was coerced. So we grouped them all to say criminal armed groups. that are non-state actors. And after seeing all of this and running the numbers, which we kept getting a really high percentage, I was like, are we sure we're right? Because this is a big deal. We actually drew the line at what we would call persecution under the refugee definition. So it's where we found serious harm and the absence of state protection. So it wasn't enough for a girl to say, I was sexually assaulted by gang members on my way to school. It had to be, and there was no way for me to get protection from my own government. So it's both, right? And that's when it rose to the level of persecution, and that's where we drew the line, which was pretty controversial internally for us. But when we did that, here's the headline. Nearly 60% of the children we talked to are fleeing chronic violence, many fleeing for their lives. A huge difference from the 13% we had seen in 2006, 2008. And they were all randomly selected. So there we go. For the UN Refugee Agency, we're now concerned that in this mixed flow, and it's undeniable that some of them still want to just go see mom that they've never met, or they might just want to go to school because it's undeniable the impoverished conditions that do exist. But what's also undeniable is the extent to which there's a refugee dimension in this flow. So with that said, what's the next slide? All right. These are ORR led us. So all the children we interviewed were in federal custody. So some of them were in ORR custody. Some of them were in Border Patrol custody. Actually, those were specifically the Mexicans. So we interviewed them after the government had interviewed them. And we were able to take hands. So I love this photo because it just kind of reminds us and grounds us in the humanity of all of it. These are hands of the different children that we were able to interview. So I'm going to leave this slide up here for just a second as I flag, I guess, 3 main messages here. Top line problem is that the migration patterns in this region have changed. Full stop. It's gone from one with this phenomenon of 8,000 children to last year, clearing 70,000, approaching nearly 70,000 unaccompanied children. You know, this isn't normal. It's not about smugglers. And on the note of smugglers, I have to just say, I talked about criminal armed groups using this area to move commodities. Here it is. I don't think that the narrative of the coyote friend, while that might still exist at the neighborhood level, I think the people who are being smuggled are much more of a commodity now than previously they were a lot more of a customer. And now they're just another commodity that's being shuffled through, which is of major concern. All right, so the migration patterns have changed. Number 2, we're concerned. Yes, not all of them are refugees. But now that we know 60% are fleeing chronic violence, this changes it. And we need to, recognition of this evidence of forced displacement informs what the appropriate humanitarian solution ought to be. So then what are these solutions? Okay, this is a regional challenge. While we looked at the kids from everywhere else, we drew conclusions at the regional level. The situation in Honduras is very different from the situation in El Salvador, which is very different from the situation in Guatemala and Mexico. We'll say we're very different from all of them, and they're actually right. It's very different. But it's still a regional challenge, and it requires regional solutions. Our main ask as the UN Refugee Agency, and I'm probably bleeding into a little bit of the advocacy, is we want to make sure that any child, whether they're on Mexican territory, whether they're on U.S. territory, and whether they're in Argentina or Chile, anywhere, is that they have access to the procedure to be able to tell their story. And it's pretty simple, right? Just access. And if you don't have access to that, then we're running really close to the risk of refoulement. What is refoulement? Refoulement is sending back a person, whether it's an adult or a child, back to a place where they fear for their lives of freedom without having access to someone to actually review their claim. And in the U.S. context, just to break it down, access to someone who can review their claim would be an asylum officer or an immigration judge, not a quick screening from a border authority to review and make these decisions, life and death decisions, in 5 minutes. Again, we weren't even able to get the information we needed. I'm concerned that we spent an hour or 2 hours with people, and a lot of the information we found was on their way out the door. So it could be larger, and maybe there was other information we didn't find. Anyway, so next slide. All right. So here is a lazy conclusion that's such a dominant narrative in this country that I just have to speak to it. So one is, okay, well, they're not a refugee under U.S. law. And Jen, I'm going to bleed over my time a little bit by agreement with Aryah, okay? Because she's like, I'm not covering this, am I? So I'm gonna do my best to cover a few more slides. So are they refugees? Okay. So I speak for the UN Refugee Agency, and while we have not done refugee status determinations, if it walks like a duck, it sounds like a duck, it looks like a duck, it's looking a lot like a duck to us. The indicators are there. We are the last people, it's the last red flag to say there is a situation happening in Central America, and it's gotten so bad, that maybe before it caused forced displacement, we had people who were confined to their homes. You have forced displacement where now neighborhoods are abandoned completely. And places in like Honduras where there's still rural areas, we have people who are moving to rural areas and, don't even recognize that they are internally displaced persons. But then you have places like El Salvador where there isn't any real rural area to go to. And even if you could, there is no way to make a living. So, these are really compounding issues. And when UN Refugee Agency is here to say, all right, people, we have now crossed international borders, we're now triggering forced displacement, and now the refugee definition is coming into play because refugee definition, you're no longer in your country of origin or last habitual residence. You're leaving for fear, a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons, related to 5 particular grounds. We're getting there. So here's the narrative that bugs me, is to say, well, gang violence doesn't qualify for asylum under U.S. law. And it bugs me because it's just not true. And it's not true for the following reasons. So is the law complicated? Yes. Has UNHCR been entering amicus briefs on how to formulate a particular social group? Absolutely. Have we gotten some progress? I'm going to say yes, and a lot of progress, for the following reasons. Is that usually what ends up being litigated in the circuits are the cases that aren't approved, right? So the cases that are approved, no one really knows about. So we've got the asylum office that's saying, but we approve these cases all the time. It's like, yes, but you don't publish them. There's no way to prove it. How do we articulate that? If you want to give us profiles, we'll message that out, for you. Immigration first instance, again, we all know these are not published. So it's going to be a lot of the challenging cases where there's a particular issue. So to say gang violence is not fair. So the particular social group is not a person who is fleeing gang violence. But it might be a child of a particular family that's being targeted. It might be that that child doesn't want to join because of political reasons. So these are challenges not just for this region. We've got we've got Boko Haram, we have, gangs all over the world. So this is a global challenge for us, and at the request of governments, we have gone through the Refugee Convention, our handbooks, and really issued some guidelines, which is as hard of soft law as you can possibly get, that other governments follow, that gets cited in a lot of domestic U.S. jurisprudence. So I guess the top one was and here's the tier. We've got guidance notes and we have guidelines. All right. So in 2010, there was a guidance note on refugee claims related to victims of organized gangs. So it doesn't have to be a particular social group. It might be a political opinion. You may not join a gang because it's against your religion. You may not join. There's tons of different things. So it's just not, to conclude and to rely, and I hear this from different factions, even of the U.S. government, to say, but the U.S. law doesn't recognize, is actually not true. And secondly, states don't get to have their own refugee definition after they've signed on to the UN Refugee Convention. It's all one. Can you imagine if Turkey or Jordan or other countries said, yeah, but those fleeing non-state actors in different regions, don't qualify for asylum here. We'd have a challenge. You can't carve out the definition. It was already agreed upon. It's a lot more politically challenging than how I just simplified it, but I just don't don't buy into that narrative. And there's a lot actually at the US domestic jurisprudence level that covers it. So for more guidance, gender-related persecution. Okay, so, the instances, what really grabbed our attention from our statistics was the number of, since we did our study, 2013, in 2014 the flow was larger, the children were younger, and there were more girls in that. And certainly the girls, when they talked about the sexual-based violence, to be gang raped, that there's, a word for that, it's just, there's the gender-based violence option, so, who is the persecutor? U.S. government and U.S. law is very generous in granting protection to people who are victims of persecution by non-state actors. Let's look at child soldiers, the forced recruitment for child soldiers. U.S. law is very generous. Boko Haram, in the resettlement context, there's a lot of generosity. So it could be gender-related persecution, membership in a particular social group. We've got guidance on this. Another thing is how children experience persecution is actually different from how adults experience persecution. And I will freely admit that this was an aha moment, like maybe, a decade ago for us. And we wanted to address that and help governments to appreciate the aha moment as well. So what may not be, maybe that's not such serious harm for an adult, could be incredibly impactful for that child. So how do you evaluate the child's claim? And so these are guidance notes that we keep sending out to the U.S. government, to the immigration judges, to the RAO. We keep doing trainings on them. Their lessons plans. The child one needs to be updated. We've been pushing them to do that. So we hope to do that later this year. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to let you know, I am not doing this one. Only to say that of the 404 children that we talked to, 4 gave some kind of indication that we hear that the U.S. government treats children well. And actually 0 knew anything about immigration policies, 0. So to say that, well, I hear that Obama has a new DACA program that I might be able to qualify for, the children just did not know. And they didn't even know who we were. They don't even know what a refugee is, yeah? Next slide. Protection concerns. Yeah, these are protection concerns. Okay, so Aryah, I'm going to stick at the regional and let you do domestic. All right. All right. There's a lot of words up here, and I'm just going to simplify. We've got 2 major protection concerns right now, and is where we're focusing. If we have a refugee dimension, then a response requires a response that's appropriate to a refugee flow. Enforcement measures doesn't really address the problem. And as we're seeing enforcement measures, whether it's tighter border security in Mexico, funded and supported by the U.S. government in an attempt to stem the flow, this is a challenge. When we see the U.S. border and the use of detention as deterrence, we've heard the narrative, right? Deterrence, stem the flow, and this is of major concern when we're talking about a flow that has a well-known and well-documented refugee dimension. And by the way, actually, 2 other statistics that you have to write down are as follows. So I told you that 60% presented international protection concerns. We did another study of unaccompanied children in Mexico that was published a few months ago, I would say November of 2014. I'll circulate the English executive summary, so it was called Uprooted. And in that one, we actually found that nearly 50% had escaped direct threats or had already experienced violence. So really debuking the whole concept that this is generalized violence, that people are leaving preemptively, which is kind of sad, right? A mom has to wait for the child to get threatened in order to be able to seek kind of protection for that child. So 50% have experienced direct threats. And the last one I'm going to leave you with is 70% of the families. So we have 70,000 children who've come unaccompanied, and we have another 70,000 that have come with their parents. So we're talking about, in one fiscal year, 140,000. So of the families that have gone through the credible fear, 70% And we can argue, but I mean, international threshold for being able to access protection is here. The US threshold was here, and maybe it's here now, yeah? And even despite that, 70% are being found to be legitimate asylum seekers by the US government. So that's a higher statistic than what we had put forward. So to end, the major protection challenges here are going to be this enforcement paradigm and this conversation. I mean, addressing the root causes, development, and we talked about a double-edged sword, which I fully agree with. But no matter how much money, whether it's $1 billion, whether it's $2 billion, whether it's more than the current, $7 million for the entire region, it's always going to be a lot cheaper than the detention facilities, than funding either the enforcement or the humanitarian response, which isn't funded. And this enforcement paradigm is approaching interdiction, especially along Mexico's southern border. And it has to account for what we think is probably the biggest challenge, is the identification of persons in need of international protection and facilitate access to asylum. Or, if those measures aren't taken, then this really risks the possibility of being measured against the prohibition of refoulement. And indirect refoulement, so the U.S. participating in Mexico's enforcement efforts, I mean, that's still, indirect refoulement is still refoulement. So, I think there's one more slide. Oh. Okay, one more? Yeah. Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna go ahead and close my notebook here and to say, the Jesuits, the Washington Office on Latin America, have pulled incredible resources together. In particular, there was one report that they filed as an official filing with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. That certainly has to be a resource that we circulate. But if you're interested in knowing about U.S. foreign policy and interdiction and externalizing of U.S. borders, all of the juicy details are in there. And all of this, I mean, the U.S. government has been very open and very public about trying to deter, and are very proud of these efforts as well too. And we're asking and hoping that we can get in there to say, well, while we're training, can we also tell people what a refugee is or what the obligations might be. And we're also really concerned too. In December, I got to go to Honduras, and to see that the Honduran military police are now guarding their own border. So it's actually much harder for any child, as well as any adult, but particularly a child, and that's maybe always been the case. But an unaccompanied child can no longer leave their own country, even if with documents. They can no longer leave their own country through safe channels. And if they're fleeing for their life and they have to choose, the burning house or leaving through very unsafe channels, I mean, these are the choices that children and their parents are having to make. And younger children, their parents are leaving whatever life they knew in order to accompany their children for what they know will be an unsafe journey. So I think we need to give the parents a lot more credit in that they know these dangers, and the children know these dangers, and actually are very scared of it, but they're a lot more scared of what it is that they're leaving. So to see that the Honduran governments and El Salvador and Guatemalan governments are actually now an impediment for their own country's citizens to be able to leave and to, the right to migrate, which isn't, our thing. But it's getting much harder for people to leave. And, to show, anyway. And a lot of them are participating in a lot of trainings supported by the U.S. government. So this is there's a lot of regional cooperation that's happening, and we just hope that we can flip it from the enforcement-only vision to we get enforcement. We understand that migration needs to be managed, or that you feel that migration needs to be managed to a certain extent for security reasons. But how do you identify those people who are in need of protection? And right now, the only opening that we have is to be with these children when they're returned, with places like Casa Alianza in Honduras that, I mean, we're talking about some serious inspirational heroes, what they're doing there. And when they are returned, to hear their stories of how they tried to leave, the challenges that they faced, but to be rejected, from the U.S., to be rejected from Mexico. I mean, these are the harrowing stories, and then you multiply at times the empirical data we now have in the numbers. This is the situation we have before us, and how do we, move forward in the U.S. in terms of immigration reform, but not at the cost of protecting real-life people, children, families, adults who are in need of international protection. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing at this point? I also have a cold, so I'm going to be battling the same as Leslie. So I'm actually going to pick up at a different point. I also want to thank AILA and Chen, of course, and everyone who collaborated in this training. I think it's really critical at this juncture, because we're at a very critical point in this program where we're seeing very few applications, and this is something that our colleagues from the refugee resettlement agencies are going to share with us and some of their concerns. I'm going to shift us into the domestic context. I'm going to do it briefly. The reason we want to do this is to just share our information, but I think the two key reasons that it's important to place ourselves in the domestic context as well, is that many of us in this room have spent many years advocating for unaccompanied children in the United States, and we have a wealth of expertise and knowledge connected to communities here, and this is something that makes us important to the success of the ICP CAM program. With that knowledge and expertise, we are effective advocates, and we can step forward and partner with resettlement agencies to make this program more robust. And so a lot of us know these statistics. We've seen them repeated over and over. So I just want to make sure we have this common background. And some of the numbers, these numbers that the government puts out are often in ranges. So first and foremost, what gave rise to this ICP CAM program was the surge of last year, which many of us know was not a surge from last year, but was actually a buildup from many years before. But it was widely reported that way, and the largest number of children were recorded last year as being apprehended. So ORR has reported a number somewhere between 58,000 and 64,000. I have this number up here. And that was in last year, in 2014. And the comparative trend is that this year, there's been a 39% drop from last year. But US government sources are still projecting that the numbers will start to climb back up. So this is an important context, because it was this context that birthed the ICP CAM program. It was viewed, the in-country processing policy was viewed as another way to address a refugee situation. And my colleagues are going to address that program in much more detail. And the next piece is what happened to all these children. Well, many of us in the room work in what's called the release location. So children that came into custody and they were released from the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So what did that mean for us? So 90% of this range of 58 to 64,000 children ended up in our communities with our attorneys and social services providers trying to absorb and address the protection needs of these children. So in 2014, almost 90% of these children that were apprehended were released. And what that means is that as legal services organizations that work across the country, we became overwhelmed with the number of children who needed attorneys to represent them in immigration court, with the wraparound social service needs of children with trauma and grief and various forms of complex PTSD. educational issues, access to education, a whole host of issues that many of you, perhaps in this room, have had to deal with on a case-by-case basis. And so part of the message here is that the in-country processing program is not something that we're asking immigrant legal service providers to take on. It's a partnership, because in the end, it's the refugee resettlement agencies who operationally do the work for the program, but they need the connection to the community. And so we are in these 90% of the communities and can play an important role. And then, of course, just by way of reference, the remaining 10% either remain in federal custody or are in federal foster care programs, where there are usually services to provide support for them there. Next slide. So this particular slide really focuses in on the released communities, and it's a map here of the key states, the top 10 states, where unaccompanied children were released to last year, based on numbers. They have now been updated, so these were the numbers back at the end of the year. But what we can see is, and the importance of this particular map, is we can see where a lot of our Central American communities are based, the strongest and most prevalent ones, and that will help us as we think about doing outreach in these communities. Many legal service providers, of course, are not here in the room today, so we have our wonderful representatives from Virginia and Maryland and DC, but we can see that it cuts across the country. And this network, as legal service providers for children, we have lots of networks that we use. Child Immigration Listserv, we have various networks through USCRI, USCCB, the Vera Institute, Department of Justice, Justice AmeriCorps. There's a lot of networks that child immigration providers operate with, and we have these concentrations that we can use to try to think about how do we find people who might be eligible for this program. So this is a map to keep in mind about the release locations. So this is a context, and I think Greg alluded to this in the opening. This is the context of asylum for us in the United States. It's important because later you're going to hear about the in-country processing program and how it's different from how things operate here. So many of you may be familiar with this, but essentially the asylum process here is, because of an amendment in the TVPRA of 2008, is an affirmative process for the most part if the child can demonstrate this. So in the process here, there's a legal screening. So we have Know Your Rights legal services providers in ORR facilities that provide information to children about asylum and how they would qualify and what asylum means. As Leslie mentioned, a lot of children really don't have any idea about immigration policy or forms of relief, contrary to some of the mythology that's been told about children knowing about immigration before they get here. So many of the children, this is their first exposure to what it means to seek asylum in the domestic context. However, one of the greater challenges of our system is that while the children may know about asylum, may have a general idea of this as a form of defense against removal, they actually lack legal representation. So any of you that have done an asylum case in the US know the complexity of asylum law and how difficult it is for a child, if impossible, to navigate this type of relief alone. So this past year, fortunately, as a proportional number of the almost 60,000 kids that came in, we were able to get funding for about 30% of them. But the remaining 70% of unaccompanied children today who are going to immigration court, if they receive notice, do not have attorneys representing them. This is a significant advocacy issue for our community, and we know that it has a huge impact to have an attorney or an advocate accompanying you through the immigration process in order to present your defenses, in order to present evidence, to get testimony, all the elements that you need to win an asylum claim. You really need an attorney or advocate to represent you in this process. So what have we seen in terms of asylum for the children that have arrived from the summer? Something positive, which I think Leslie spoke about. Although we don't know all the grounds for which they're winning, we are seeing that the grant rate by USCIS, the affirmative asylum adjudicator, is about 58% nationwide. It does vary office by office, and it's very close. Actually, I think the exact number in our UNHCR report of children who are in need of protection. So this is this has been a great success. It certainly demonstrates how legal representation makes a difference. And I think that some of our concerns is we've heard a little bit of rumbling that this number seems to be too high. There must be something amiss, because how could it be so high? So this is an asylum advocacy watch group as well. We're going to watch very carefully to make sure that these numbers stay or increase. We certainly don't want any type of backlash against what's really been successful in terms of asylum advocacy. And what types of grants of asylum do we see? Very similar to the ones identified in the various reports that Leslie mentioned. We see child abuse-based, sexual and gender-based violence, gang or cartel-related violence. Even the gang ones are being granted. As Leslie mentioned, they're just not published, not publicly available. So this is important to think about, because the children that are in the region that may qualify for the in-country processing program will have to demonstrate this as well. And our colleagues are going to go into more detail on that. In our asylum process, we usually have a little bit more time to prepare children who have been traumatized, who've suffered complex complex types of trauma, and they also have cultural considerations about disclosure of abuse. So for those that have worked with these children from the region, you know how difficult it is for children to come forward and tell you, I have been sexually abused, or I've been physically abused by a parent or legal guardian. It can be a very humiliating experience. It's not the most culturally appropriate one that children would engage with, because they usually respect the authority. So there's a lot of cultural considerations that are important in our process. And so it's good to remember this as we talk about the program through the rest of the morning, and how this is unique to our domestic context. There's two more points down here that I'm just going to touch on briefly. The next point is the expedited hearing process. Since the summer, because of the administration's preference for a deterrent strategy, there was an effort to expedite immigration court hearings, giving children very short periods of time to show up in court with attorneys. As a result of this, just last Friday, the LA Times published an article where approximately 7,700 children have been issued deportation orders in absentia. They have not actually been deported at this point, so I do want to make that clear. There was some confusion. They've just been issued those in absentia orders. And many of us are very concerned about children in that group who would be eligible for relief, who never had the opportunity to have an attorney represent them in their hearings. So this type of expedited process for children is highly disadvantageous. So children have a difficult time making it to court if they don't receive notice, certainly, and if they don't have anyone accompanying them. And finally, limited post-release services. So we know that in our community of unaccompanied children, there's been an effort to increase the number of services available to children once they've been released from custody. But this continues to be a challenge for us. And that's why the wraparound social services that I mentioned are not often available. So lawyers are taking this on themselves, looking for social workers, looking for healthcare, looking for housing, so a lot of these things are happening at our domestic level. Next. And I just want to close on family detention. I think that a lot of last summer focused on unaccompanied children, and I think as a community, it's really important to remember our accompanied children, children who come with a parent. And family detention has really skyrocketed in the United States, and they are held in prison-like conditions. These are some of the facilities. And this is even though various nonprofits, some of whom are in the room, have developed alternatives to detention that are less costly. The current approach is to keep families in detention. It makes it very difficult for them to seek asylum, and also very limited access to attorneys. And this is important to remember because we will hear about in the ICP program how it's possible to also apply for a spouse. And so this has a connection to our family detention world, and we just want to always remember that they are our partners in this work as well, and could also be part of our outreach strategy to ensure that mothers and children or fathers and children also know about this program to determine if they may be eligible. So I'm going to leave it there and open the floor for Q&A. For a couple questions. As we said in the beginning, if you could please identify yourself by name and your organization when you ask a question, that gives us an opportunity to get to know each other during the Q&A period. Yes, so we have a question here and one back there.
Hey, this is Shana with the National Advocacy Office of the Jesuits of the United States. I'm actually wondering about this kind of currently lack of or few applications, and whether it stems in part from the problem of the narrative actually having been wrong about, that parents are soliciting that their kids come, and that's why all these kids are arriving. And instead, the fact that really, from our understanding, the kids left the country, many of their own volition, some of them even showing up without their parents having known that they were leaving, kids making the first decision in their communities and actually identifying that they were in need of protection while they were in country. And so parents not kind of being used to and this might be for the later portion, probably, sorry. But then how important it is to grasp the circumstances in country and connect with NGOs down in country who can help to explain what the process is for children who are in those communities. Sorry, that's half a comment, half a question.
No, thank you very much. Do any of the panelists, would you all like to respond to that, or anyone who will be appearing later in the day? Well, yeah, we'll address it later. I think for those who don't know the ICP program, there have been a very few number of applications. I think it's now at 187 applications in total for the whole region. So that's why we have this briefing today. And I think the point that you're making, Shane, is really critical about also collaborating with NGO partners in the region. And also understanding some of the culture and why children leave. So children may not tell a parent, I'm leaving because my uncle's sexually abusing me. You don't learn that until the child's here and safe with the parent, that they then tell you, my uncle was sexually abusing me. Can you please help me? I don't want to go back. So it doesn't happen until they get here because they don't have a safe place in country when they tell that parent to go. And it's something we'll address in a few minutes. There was a second question.
Yes. Hi, Julia McPherson with Jesuit Refugee Service. The 70% of UACs who don't have legal representation, can you talk a bit more about the U.S. government's stance on legal representation, the limitations, and then just for those of us who aren't intimately involved in sort of the process, then how do the children receive, secure legal representation? Who in the community sort of drives that, the various players, just to think through the gap and how we can address it.
Sure,
Thank
that's
you.
a great question. So legal representation for persons in removal proceedings have been controversial for many years. And in the context of unaccompanied children, we've been able to make progress as categorizing it as a vulnerable population, together with adults who have mental competency challenges. And so in that context, we've advocated for the appointment of counsel for children, but have not yet been able to achieve that goal. What we do have is both the Department of Health and Human Services, through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, through particular legislation, is mandated to the greatest extent possible to provide pro bono legal services to children. And through that, they have funded the Vera Institute of Justice that subcontracts with legal services organizations across the country, and a child advocate program. And they have also subcontracted with USCRI, who's with us today, and USCCB, who's also with us today, and they can speak to that as well, to subcontract to affiliates across the country to provide legal services and child advocates to children. That was done last summer in the context of the surge, so it was a great step forward, but still proportionally is not able to reach all of the children. The goal, of course, is that all children should have legal representation, and currently there is a right to counsel litigation that's based in Seattle that the ACLU and Public Counsel launched, where they are arguing for appointment of counsel for all children in removal proceedings. And oral arguments were last Friday, so we're waiting to hear what will happen in that case. In terms of strategies, I think we as a coalition have advocated for the government to allocate more, to appropriate more funds for legal representation for children, and to prioritize that as a vulnerable group. And we're still fighting for that. So if there are others interested in that, that particular advocacy effort, there's a whole group of us in here that would love to have your collaboration in working towards that. The referral system happens, we have some of our experts in the room here, but when children are in custody, they're referred to this network of affiliates. Oh, and I forgot to mention the Department of Justice. I don't want to forget them. Justice AmeriCorps was launched last summer. It was not necessarily related to the surge. It was a program that was initiated before that. And so Justice AmeriCorps also has attorneys that are across a network of affiliates. And so we have these different networks available. So the referral system, when the children are in custody, the legal services organizations that do the legal services in custody will refer the children to, if there is an agency, to legal services in the released location, actually connecting and referring the case. It's not a seamless system, but I think everyone's working to try to make it as seamless as possible. And that's basically how it functions. Okay, so we're going to wrap up the background section, and we're going to move to our colleagues from USCRI. Stacey Blake.